Chapter 18. "Here, I've got it," AJ said, grabbing Eve's carry-on bag out of the overhead compartment. "It's heavy, be careful," Eve said as he pulled it out. The bag came out with a thud against his shoulder. No kidding, what's in here anyway? Rocks? Carefully, he readjusted the luggage in his arms as they started down the aisle to get out of the plane. "I can't tell you what's in there. If I did, you might know all of my secrets," she said as she purposely stopped walking one step so that his body would shadow hers a little closer. She couldn't explain it, but she really liked the safety of being so close to him. Mischievousness flashed through his eyes. "I don't already?" "Not by a long shot," she said with a smile. "Not by a long shot." Reluctantly, she turned and followed the other passengers out of the door and across the sky cab until once again they were standing in Houston, Texas. It's good to be home. "You didn't like the mountains?" he asked, and she heard the hint of vulnerability under the teasing. "The mountains, the stars, the snow. When are we going back?" she asked as they started out of the gate. He looked up at a monitor. "First flight to New Mexico leaves in 2 hours. Her arm wound through his. Boy, Lisa and Jeff would be surprised. Not half as surprised as my boss would be tomorrow. Ugh, work. She flipped her hair back so she could lay her head on his shoulder. Maybe home isn't such a good thing after all. They stepped onto the escalator marked baggage claim. "So you think they'll make it back all right?" "I just hope Lisa's had some psychological training," AJ said. Jeff wasn't exactly calm and cool about the whole situation. "Oh, so you noticed that too?" Incredulously, AJ shook his head. "I always thought he was so together." "Jeff?" Eve asked incredulously. "Mr. I can't get 2 words out to save my life?" AJ's face scrunched in disbelief. "Jeff?" "Oh my gosh, you should have seen him with Dustin that first time we all went out. You would have thought he was part of the wallpaper." "I would never have pegged him for shy." "Ugh, no. Shy would have been a major step up." "Geez, what happened to him? I mean, I don't know that he's exactly outgoing, but he's certainly not bashful." Eve smiled, remembering Lisa's words from the cabin. She tightened her grip on AJ's arm. "He found Lise." They walked up to the baggage return and stopped. No part of Eve ever wanted to let go of him again. AJ dropped one of the bags to the floor. "I guess love can do amazing things to a person," he said, draping an arm around her when he straightened. That arm felt better than anything had in a very long time. "Yes, it can," she said, as she laid her hand on his chest, and nowhere in her was there any hesitation. It wasn't until they got to the little silver car in the parking garage that AJ felt the full brunt of being home again. Her bags were stowed in the trunk. At her door, knowing they weren't going to the same place, his heart yanked up into his throat. "Well," he said, reaching for her hand between them, "you drive careful." "You too," she said, gazing into his eyes as though her only hope was that he would find a way not to say goodbye. "I'll see you?" he asked, suddenly unsure of what was going to happen when he turned and walked away from her. "Yeah, I owe you a pizza, remember?" Softly, he smiled. "Yeah, seems like I remember that part." A moment, and he could stay away from her no longer. As she slid into his arms, even staying in that steamy parking garage forever seemed preferable to the alternative. He closed his eyes, imprinting her on his memory. Finally, the hug broke, and he looked at her uncertainly. "Can I call you?" "You better." What he wanted to do was to take her into his arms and tell her the rest of the world would just have to deal with it. What he did was lean into her and brush her lips with his. It certainly didn't help, but to just leave, to just walk away, was certain to kill him too. "I'll see you later?" he asked, leaning down so he could see her eyes as she ducked her head. She nodded and then turned to the car. He waited until she was in the driver's seat before he smiled and slammed her door. His car was on a different level, so he stood and waited with one small wave as she backed out and headed out of the parking garage. As his gaze fell to the 2 lone bags at his feet, ache traced through his heart. Their perfect weekend was over, and here he stood on the other side, wondering if the magic in the mountains could possibly survive in the real world of life. Reluctantly, he picked up his bags and headed for his own car. One day, it didn't seem like that big of a deal when Eve had called into work to tell them she would be a day late. However, the moment she hit work the next morning, it was clear that one day made more difference than she had ever realized. "The spring show is Saturday," Mary Jo said as Eve sat in the conference room Wednesday morning. "Saturday, and we are not ready. We've got run-throughs tomorrow, and the way this is looking, we'll be lucky to have half of the show ready by then. So that we don't have to waste time in assignments, I've written them all out here." She handed a stack of papers out to the people on either side of her. Eve took one for herself and passed them on. As Mary Jo continued her diatribe, Eve's gaze took in how the hours of her life from now until the weekend would play out. Somehow, this job hadn't looked like so much work when she'd first gotten it. The others began standing around her, and Eve's concentration came back to reality. "And Eve?" Mary Jo said as the others began to disperse. "Yeah?" Eve asked. "I want you to be point person on this. Make sure that everyone else gets their part done. If they don't, do it." Eve nodded, even as her mind traced through the tasks that was going to mean would fall to her at the last of the last minutes. "I'm thinking about talking to the store manager about moving you up if you make this work," Mary Jo said. "I'll keep that in mind," Eve said shakily. The ramifications of where up could be shook her to the core, but she buried that. "I'll do my best." AJ hated rain, especially the kind that liked to fall when he wasn't totally sure where a call was located. True, he knew most of Houston by heart, but there were still a few streets that didn't just jump forth in his head when he heard them come over the radio, and a few that were so closely named that they interlaced in the files in his mind. "Are you sure this is right?" Lerone asked when they turned at an intersection. He looked behind him. "I think that sign said Commerce. We need Congress." "Commerce? Congress? Aren't they both right here?" AJ asked, fumbling through the memorized maps in his head as Lerone worked with a perpetually obnoxious GPS that had never worked quite right. "I think Congress must be the next street over, or 2 streets over," Lerone said as they got to an intersection clogged with vehicles. "Which way?" AJ asked. South, I think." Sirens going, AJ turned and fought his way through the traffic as he peered helplessly through the driving rain to see the next sign. His mind didn't have to see it. His heart felt the time sliding by. Franklin, crud, that's not it." "It's this next one," Lerone said, pointing ahead of them and giving up on the GPS completely. AJ picked his way forward, and relief poured over him at the sight of Congress Street. They turned into the traffic, stacked in all directions at a mid-afternoon standstill. "Go around them," Lerone said. "There's not room." Slowly the vehicles in front of them exited to the sides, affording space by little bits. "What's this block?" AJ asked, not wanting to take his gaze off the rain-streaked road. "We've got 2 more blocks," Lerone said. "Yep, there's the lights." "Thank God," AJ said, wondering how much more his nerves could possibly take. The ambulance came to a stop 6 cars back from the melee that had not so long before been a simple intersection. Throwing it into park, AJ grabbed his bag, jumped from his side, and followed Lerone, who was already several strides ahead of him on the sidewalk. Police, fire trucks, emergency workers were running in all directions. "Over here!" one of the firefighters yelled, directing AJ into the center of the storm. "This one needs help." AJ banked to the right even as Lerone ran on. The woman who sat, leaning against the stoplight pole, had bloody trails streaming down her face as the firefighter kneeling next to her fought to keep her calm. For a moment, AJ wondered why the other 2 paramedic crews weren't attending to her. Then he realized that there were at least 4 cars smashed in the rain-blurred intersection. Multiple victims. How many and how bad? That was for others to sort out. His mission at this moment was to help this woman in front of him. "What do we got?" AJ asked, bending down as the rain slid through his hair. Head gash, the firefighter said as AJ sat on his heels to examine the victim. AJ? He looked at the firefighter in full gear, and the face and voice slipped through his consciousness. Gabe. Recognition, and then something else. Not one part of him liked the look in Gabe's eyes. Please, the woman wailed, pushing against Gabe's hands. Please, I have to get to my baby. AJ refocused on the task in front of him. Okay, listen, I need you to calm down, ma'am. Her name's Serena, Gabe said, and as much as AJ hadn't liked the look in Gabe's eyes, he liked the tone of his voice even less. Okay, Serena, I need you to take deep breaths for me. He tried to look at the gash across the right side of her head, but she wouldn't sit still. I'm fine. Please, help them, she cried. Please, I'm fine. It's deep, AJ said to Gabe, who continued to pin the semi-struggling woman to the pole. No, please, don't worry about me. Help them. We need to clean this up so we can see what we need to get done, AJ said as the blood streamed down his gloves. Then, for a split second, his mind registered the long black hair and the angle of the nose. He shook his head to clear it of Eve's face. It wasn't Eve. Carefully, he worked with the wound, fighting to get the bleeding stopped. Have they gotten them out yet? The woman asked AJ, and the terror in her eyes ripped his heart out. They're working on it, Gabe said. They have to get them out. They have to. AJ pursed his lips so that his mind would stay on the task at hand. Through the hair, it was hard to tell how deep the gash was, but from the blood pouring out, it was a fair guess that it was far more than a scratch. They said they were getting them out, she said, grabbing at AJ's hands. But I haven't seen either of them. Can you see if they've gotten them out, please? I'm sure they're doing all they can, AJ said. Without a breakdown of the actual accident, his mind worked through the details. Gash on the right, she was probably in the passenger seat. Someone ran a red light, and the other cars hit hers in the driver's door. He could see the spidered glass of the passenger window, although he didn't bother to look. That's why they had gotten her out first. She was the easiest. But who else was in there? He fought not to think about it as his hands worked to stymie the blood. I think we'd have a better shot at this if we weren't on a street corner, he finally said to Gabe. Lerone ran by, headed back to the ambulance. Hey, Lerone, AJ called to him. We need help here. She's yours. We've got a mess up there, Lerone called back even as he kept running. AJ looked around and realized he was the help. What do you need? Gabe asked, looking up to him for guidance. We've got to get her back to the ambulance. Just tell me what to do. No, not pink, Eve said in frustration. I said fuchsia. Don't you know what fuchsia is? I'll work on it, the girl who looked half of Eve's age said, buckling backward. Do that. Eve glanced at her watch. It was after 3, and she hadn't had so much as a Cheeto since before 7 that morning. Ms. Knox, they told me I was supposed to tell you that one rack went through a mud puddle on the way in. They need to know what to do about it. A mud puddle? Oh, come on. What do they think this is, California? Haven't they ever dealt with rain before? She stomped off to solve the latest dilemma, grateful only for the fact that her dilemmas involved only mud-caked one-of-a-kind outfits instead of irreplaceable lives. How's her husband? AJ asked when they shut the doors so that the paramedic that had just arrived could work on the woman. Being 45 feet closer to getting out, she was better off going with that crew. Bad, Gabe said as they made their way back to the wreck. I'm not sure he's even got a chance, and the baby's worse. AJ glanced back at the closed doors that were slowly disappearing into the crowded street. The baby? He was in the back, Gabe said as they made their way back up to the scene. Driver's side. The little family picture from a cabin bedroom deep in the woods crashed into AJ's mind as his gaze took in the scene ahead of them. Rain slid down his face, soaking into his soul. AJ, Lerone called from where he was kneeling next to one of the victims. We need you, man! Without waiting for more of an update, AJ raced to the middle of the rain-soaked street. I'm here. Take over the chest, Lerone said as his hands worked to get air into the victim through the hand breather. AJ dropped to his knees on the other side of the immobile figure and found the compression area. 1, 2, 3. 2 models are out, Mary Jo said as she strode through the room where Eve was busy sorting through what could be washed, what couldn't be washed, and their options from there. Out? She asked through the pencil in her mouth. Asian flu. It's only Wednesday. Maybe they'll be better by Saturday. And maybe 6 more will go down between now and then. That's not even funny, Eve said, looking up from where she knelt on the cold concrete floor. I'm not laughing, Mary Jo said. 1, 2, 3. AJ continued to count as the rain dripped off his forehead onto the open shirt of the man lying on the street. Minutes and minutes had elapsed since AJ had heard a heartbeat. In truth, there hadn't been one since he'd started, but still he worked, willing his own life into this body. He bent down to listen between the artificial breaths. There's no pulse, the EMT that AJ had taken over for said. We need to get him into a transport, Lerone said. 1, 2, 3. AJ pushed his determination into the task as in his mind a plea for assistance from above slipped through him. AJ, man, they're here with the transport, Lerone said. AJ! He knew what backing up meant. 10, 11, 12. AJ, that's enough, man. Let's get him in the transport. 14, 15, AJ said as tears blurred through the rain. Let's get him on this, a paramedic AJ knew he should know instructed. On 3. 1, 2, 3. The man was transferred to the gurney, and the emergency workers continued to work on him as they wheeled him away. A hollow emptiness filled the center of AJ's chest. Promises, some sincere, some meant only to calm an inconsolable person, flowed through his soul. We'll do everything we can. He's in good hands. We'll take care of him. They weren't promises. They were lies. All of them. AJ, they've got 2 out on the other side. Let's go, Lerone said, clapping him on the back as he knelt in the street, now awash in rainwater. Pushing through the overwhelming fatigue dripping off his soul, AJ pulled first one leg, then the other, under him. Hazy numbness overtook him as he stepped up to the group knotted on the other side of the cars. His mind wouldn't think, and worse, he couldn't really tell that it wasn't. No, someone from the knot said. There's no use. He's gone. When they backed up, AJ saw the tiny form, looking all but lost in the sea of giants surrounding him. His heart collapsed over the sight. How old, he didn't know, but certainly not old enough to die like this. Tears and emotion collapsed over him. Suddenly, he couldn't breathe. AJ, Lerone called from farther up the street. AJ, man, get in the game. We need you. Squelching all of the pain, he sniffed back the tears, pulled indifference to him, and raced over to where Lerone was working. This makes no sense, the young girl holding the 3 outfits up for Eve's inspection said at just past 7. I can't find these on the schedule anywhere. Maybe they're extras, Eve said, her energy long since gone. I don't think so. They were with the show clothes. You have your list? Right here. The girl handed the list over to Eve. Marcia, you coming? Another employee asked as she walked by. The young girl holding the outfits looked around. Oh, yeah. Without so much as asking, she hung the outfits on the end of the rack. Let me get my purse. But, Eve started as she looked up from the list 2 moments too late. She looked at the outfits, then at the list, then at the completely empty room around her. Slowly, she shook her head. I sure hope up is worth this. AJ had been home almost 2 hours, but nothing held his attention. Television was a waste of time. He'd burned himself cooking a TV dinner in the microwave. Even the drum set had no beat. His heart hurt. Every piece of him hurt. He tried to call Jeff's place, but of course no one was home. He called Melody, but she was working. Finally, he rolled across the bed, grabbed the phone, and after dialing, he ran his fingers through his hair that had dried in no discernible pattern. The click of her machine snapped through him. and her voice, soft and gentle, washed through his soul. He considered leaving a message, but what could he say? "I need you?" That was completely lame. So, quickly, he hung up, vaguely wondering where she was. She hadn't mentioned any big plans she had for the evening, but then again, he hadn't asked. In fact, he wasn't even sure that now that they were back home, what anything that had to do with her meant to his life. Were they a couple now? And if they were, did that give him the right to ask where she would be, when? It wasn't so much that he wanted to know where she was to keep tabs on her. It was more that he felt empty, not knowing. Trying to block her and everything else out, he closed his eyes and forced himself to drift. However, he hadn't gone very far when images began to collide in his brain. The street, Lisa's smile as she held Alex for the first time, the woman bleeding and yet begging for him to help her family, the tiny bundle on the street, Jeff holding Lisa and thanking AJ for all he had done. And then, further back to long before he really even knew Lisa, he remembered how scared her voice was on that phone call, how he had wished he didn't have to tell her that Jeff was bad, that she needed to come to the emergency room right away. Then, suddenly, he was back on a darkened street, feeling the sheer invincibility of someone who had yet to lose a patient on their watch. What a joke that was! What a cruel hoax! That night, he hadn't hesitated to assure Jeff. But it wasn't so much the promises as much as his own belief in them that now cut him to the core. "He's in good hands. I promise we'll do everything we can." The promises, although vague, held out a thread of hope that AJ's soul now said was simply a stark lie. For when everything they could do wasn't enough, what then? When hope surrendered, what then? When they packed up their medical supplies and went home, what did they leave for those to whom those false promises had been made? Although he didn't want to think about it, he knew. He knew because she had told him. "I'd lie there in the floor for hours and cry." She thought he was so courageous that he could do the all but impossible, her white knight. That was the cruelest joke of them all. He was no white knight swooping in to save the day. No, he had failed her. Even before he knew her, he had failed her. His mind slipped back to a graveyard and the sight of the coffin resting for a time over a newly dug grave. All the what-ifs attacked him at once, but they all led him right back to had he done things differently, the image of that beautiful face fighting back overwhelming tears might never have happened. Guilt spread through him, and in a poor attempt to thwart it, he rolled off the bed. He was the only one who knew. If she knew what he knew, she would never want to see him again, and he didn't blame her one bit. At 11:30, Eve sighed in resignation. There was simply no more she could do tonight. With her purse tucked in one hand and her pepper spray in the other, she exited the building and crossed to her car. Once inside, she punched the button on the player and revved the engine. What was that little drumming thing that AJ did with his fingers while he drove? She tried to tap out the beat, but couldn't quite catch it. Despite the futileness of the attempt, she smiled. Through the nighttime Houston streets she drove, feeling in her heart that somehow he would call tonight. Or maybe he already had, and he'd left a message. She couldn't wait to talk to him, to tell him about her day, to hear him assure her that she could in fact make this work. That would be nice, because right now it seemed almost as daunting as delivering a baby in the very center of nowhere. However, when she got home, there was no message. Sad, but trying not to be, she went to the refrigerator and pulled out some ham. He had work today too, and it wasn't like she had told him to call her. In fact, as she thought about it, she wasn't even sure he had her number. Well, sometimes you have to do things for yourself, she thought as she pulled the phone book from the drawer. She sat down at the table and ran a finger down the listings for night. Unfortunately, she didn't know his mother's name, and there was no listing for AJ, or even A. After 3 trips down night and the names on either side of it, she gave up. It was after midnight anyway, Tomorrow she would find him, if her body was still moving by that point. And, with that thought, she went to take a shower. The next night, when Eve arrived home long after 1 in the morning, elation surged through her when she saw the blink on her machine. However, when she punched the button, it wasn't AJ she heard, but Ashley. "Hey, Eve, we're meeting over at Jeff and Lisa's tomorrow night at 7 for a surprise welcome home party. Of course, you're invited. Hope to see you there." And she was gone. Yeah, Eve thought, I hope to see me there too. 3 times in 2 days, AJ had squandered the opportunity to leave a message on her machine. He simply didn't know what to say. There were the feelings from the mountain that still brought a smile, but underneath those was the distinct possibility that his first words to her would come out, "I'm so sorry. You have every right to hate me." Every time her voice drifted over the lines, his rational instinct took over and he hung up. So, he was at least mildly excited when Ashley called to tell him about the welcome home party. It was a given that she would be there. Nonetheless, what he would say and how he would say it kept him awake long into the Thursday night as the Nerf football made its arcs into the dark night around him. "I didn't say 7. I said 700, Eve said into the phone at 6 o'clock on Friday evening. "No. How are we supposed to feed 200 people with 7 slices of ham? Turkey? Yes, they ordered turkey too. Well, my list clearly says turkey. What, are we going to have to go down this thing item for item?" She put her hand to her head as the frustration from the previous 3 days came to the surface in a growl. "How about we just start over? Would that help? Fine. Great, let's start over." "Surprise!" the 3 of them semi-yelled when Jeff appeared at the front door of their house. "Hey," he said as a smile that knifed through AJ crossed onto his face. "I was wondering when we'd see you guys." "We couldn't stay away," Ashley said. She reached up from her stance on the top step and hugged Jeff. "Now, where is that baby?" Jeff laughed and pointed through the entryway. Then he held out a hand to Gabe. "Somehow I knew you were going to figure out a way to get out of coming back on time," Gabe said, clapping a hand over the elbow attached to the hand he was shaking. "And now I'm guessing you're going to want your 2 weeks off, too." "You know it," Jeff said, laughing. "Come on in." Timidly, AJ stood on the bottom step, the gift he had been forced to get and wrap on his own tucked under his arm. "AJ," Jeff said happily, and then his smile fell into concern as he looked around the otherwise empty sidewalk. "Where's Eve?" He shrugged as the same question traced through him. "Ash invited her. I figured she'd be here." More concern traced through Jeff's face, and then he forced a brighter look onto his face. "Well, then I'm sure she's on her way. Come on in." "And Eve about flipped out," Lisa said as Gabe and Ashley sat on the couch, her arm over his leg, listening to the winding tale of baby Alex's arrival. "Well, I don't blame her," Ashley said. "Ugh, I would have been a basket case." "How far along were you?" Gabe asked, clearly calculating in his head. 36 weeks, Lisa said, readjusting the pacifier in Alex's mouth. "Man, I would have been doing more than flipping out," he said. "Them babies aren't supposed to be coming that early." "Yeah, that was the first thing Gabe said when you called," Ashley said. "He was like, she had to be like 4 weeks early, and 4 weeks at that point can make a huge difference. How much did he weigh anyway?" 5.5, Lisa said, "but everything is perfectly wonderful." Ashley smiled. "I can see that." "Okay, emergency training is one thing, but that's like in a whole nother ballgame," Gabe said skeptically. "Didn't you guys freak out?" "I did," Jeff said from his recliner as he looked over at his family, now safe and sound. "But AJ, man, he never so much as blinked." Gabe smiled over at AJ, who was having trouble keeping himself from running far and fast. "That doesn't surprise me. AJ's like, blood? Ah, no big deal." "Could we not say the B word?" Ashley asked, obviously sickened by just the thought. "Sorry," Gabe said to her as he laid an arm over her shoulders. No, you should have seen him, Jeff said. Okay, first we do this, then we do this. Let me tell you, if I'm ever in need of emergency help again, he's the one I'm going to call. The image of a woman pleading for her husband's life met in the middle of the rain-streaked image of a man who AJ had no power to bring back. Lisa and Eve did it all. I didn't do that much. He kept me sane, Jeff said, tipping his glass at AJ. That's enough to test anybody, Gabe said. I'm not arguing, Jeff said. Then Jeff's face fell with concern. By the way, where is Eve? I don't know, Ashley said. I called her and left a message. I tried calling her again last night late, but she wasn't home. AJ caught the worry in Lisa's gaze when she looked at Ashley. You didn't get a hold of her? I just figured she'd be here, Ashley continued. Lisa's gaze jumped from Ashley to AJ, and suddenly he realized what she was asking him with no words. I tried too, he said, tripping over the words, but I never could get her. There was a long moment of silence as AJ realized he should have tried harder, much harder. I'll go try again. He felt the 4 gazes follow him out. No, don't even, Eve warned. We've got less than 24 hours, and now you're telling me that we're down to 5 models, and one of them is iffy? We called as soon as we found out, the agent said. They were all on that shoot together last weekend. They must have gotten something from the water. The water? That was the very last excuse she wanted to hear. Okay, let me get this straight. The show is tomorrow, and I'm down to 4 models who may or may not have been exposed to this thing. She growled in utter frustration. Let me make some calls, see who I can round up, but if I can't come up with enough, I'm calling you back. What am I supposed to do? Find me some models. She hit the off button, fuming. This is not happening. Her hand grabbed for the phone book and flipped through the yellow pages to the listing for models. How she wished she lived in Hollywood or New York. There she could have come up with models by squeezing the woodwork. Here, it wasn't nearly so easy. Her finger traced down her options, just as her cell phone bleeped to life. Absently, she hit the button. Knox. Geez, if I didn't know any better, I'd think you were delivering another baby, AJ's voice said over the air, and without hesitation, she leaned back in her chair and breathed in the sound. If I didn't know any better, I think I was too, she said with a smile. We thought you'd be here, AJ said, and Eve looked at her watch in resignation. 9:45. Oh, man, she sat forward. Believe me, I wanted to be. Where are you? Working. This stupid spring show is tomorrow morning, and I'm beginning to wish I had the Asian flu. Hey, don't say that. The hospitals are filling with it. Tell me about it. They took half of my models hostage already. Oh, man, what a drag. She shook her head. I'm afraid I'm out for tonight. You're going to have to celebrate without me. That wouldn't be much of a celebration, he said, and she heard the disappointment in his voice. As strange as it was, that made her heart skip a beat. How are Jeff and Lisa? Good. Wondering where you are, though. I wish I could be there, but the way this is looking, I may have to pull an all-nighter the way it is. Thankful for the distraction after 3 solid days of problems, she leaned back in the chair. How are you? Cool. Things are right back to normal. I thought about calling you the other night, but I didn't have your number. You were going to call me? It was midnight, and I didn't have anything better to do. Have you ever heard of a little thing called sleep? Seems like I remember that part, but at this point it's been so long, I don't think I'd even know how to do that anymore. You need a break. Tomorrow I'm on all day. Sunday I'll think about taking a break. How does rollerblading sound? It's January. Less traffic on the sidewalks. I can pick you up if you want. You need directions? Nah, I'll just follow the sound of Help! Very funny, she said laughingly. If I was there, I'd hit you. Then I'm very glad you couldn't make it tonight. Oh, that was cruel. You wait. Believe me, I have been, he said, and his tone yanked the smile right off her face. Me too. When they signed off and Eve hung up the phone, she wondered what kind of strange power he had over her. Just hearing his voice could pull her back from insanity's brink. She looked over the project on her desk, and although not one thing about it had changed, she now had a point to focus on beyond tomorrow morning. Sunday. She couldn't wait. That one on Wednesday must have been rough, Jeff said as he and AJ stood in the kitchen rounding up snacks for the others. When AJ looked over at him in confusion, Jeff nodded out to the living room. Gabe told me. AJ scratched the back of his head. Yeah, it was. He pulled cookies out of the bag he was holding as he felt the words trace across his soul. Sometimes it gets to me, he said, feeling like he needed to tell somebody that before it exploded inside of him. Being out there, wishing I could do more, and knowing there's nothing I can really do. Jeff's gaze lost all the teasing in it. You can't do everything every time. I wish I could. If you didn't, you wouldn't be out there in the first place. You know, sometimes it's in the cards, sometimes it's not, but you just have to do the best you can with what you're dealt. Then I wish the dealer was always on my side. Sometimes I get the feeling that he isn't. The smile Jeff gave him was sympathetic. We all do. We all wish every call could turn out perfectly, that we could save everybody. But just because we can't, that doesn't mean he isn't with us on every call. It's just that sometimes he has a different plan than we wish he had. Slowly, AJ arranged the cookies on the plate. So, have you ever regretted doing this? He needed an answer, a reason to go on, or better yet, a reason to quit. Jeff glanced over, and then his gaze found the countertop. Once. AJ nodded, fully comprehending the depth of that single syllable. I wish I could go back and do that night all over again. Yeah, you and me both, Jeff said. Then he shook his head. But going back isn't what life's about. You've got to do your best with right now and let the past take care of the past. Like last week, I would have totally lost it if you hadn't been there. I didn't. Yes, you did. For me and my family, you did more than we could ever even thank you for. Jeff's gaze burrowed through AJ. And just so you know, while you're busy remembering those that didn't work out, be sure to remember the ones that did, okay? After a moment, AJ nodded, hearing the wisdom in that, but knowing it wasn't that simple. Man, that looks really good, Gabe said, slapping AJ on the back and causing him to jump. But you know where it would really look good? Where's that? Jeff asked. Out here, where the rest of us can eat it. You better watch it, Jeff said, turning with the tray of food in his hands. You're starting to sound like AJ. You say that like it's a bad thing, Gabe said, and this time he didn't sound like he was teasing at all. This has been White Knight, Book 2, The Courage series, written by Staci Stallings, narrated by Becky Dowdy. Copyright 2012 by Staci Stallings. Production copyright 2014 by Staci Stallings.
Never miss a second of the story. Like and subscribe to the Staci Stallings YouTube channel today.